Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show. This week I'm going to take you through 3 gestural drawings and some line and wash of ballroom dancers. So I've taken screen captures from the 2021 season of Strictly Come Dancing, and you can see I've got the first reference up on the top left of screen. And I'm starting out with some A4 mixed media paper and a 0.2mm nib uni-pin marker. So if you happen to catch the videos from the last couple of weeks on the channel, you'll have seen me use these marker pens to do some cattle drawings and paintings. So they put down water resistant ink, so they're great for line and wash. And the style of drawing I'm doing here today is known as gestural drawing. And the idea is to, rather than capture outlines, although I must admit I am doing some outline work here, rather than break down the figure into individual shapes like circles and rectangles and so on, what we tend to do instead is to try and let the nib of the pen just flow and try and capture some of the surface, some of the general energy, some of the general lines, and kind of describe the surface of the drawing and the movement in the figures and the energy of the figures. So ideally, one should let the pen just flow around. You should kind of be in a mindset of almost doodling, where you're kind of doing it almost unconsciously. But at the same time, hopefully some structure kind of reveals itself. So this particular drawing I'm doing here at the moment is going quite well from my point of view, but it's not fully gestural. It's not all that. It is fairly loose, but it's not completely loose and flowing. But that's the general idea anyway, to not be too hung up on total accuracy, but just try and get a sense of movement and life into the drawing. So on to pose 2. What I generally find, it's not always the case, but what I generally find when I work on multiple sketches at once, I tend to loosen up as I go. So for that reason alone, it's well worth doing. So you can see here, for example, I'm being much more relaxed with my mark making. You know, I mean, really, there's barely a face there of the woman, and where the arms are kind of connecting, there's not much there which is arm shaped really, but hopefully it's going to kind of come into focus as the drawing progresses. Now, not to be offensive in any way to ballroom dancers, but there are some similarities when it comes to painting couples dancing and painting cattle, because although for the last couple of weeks I was painting individual cattle in general, cattle obviously move in herds, and one of the things I love about painting them is the way they interact in groups, the different shapes they make and the different positions they adopt relative to each other. And of course, when you've got dancers, it's exactly the same thing, albeit very different in appearance. So from my point of view, that's a nice flowing gestural drawing I've got going on here. It's not wholly accurate, but that's not really the point. You know, the point is to capture the essence of what's going on. So pose 3. Let's see what happens this time. And this pose is quite nice, I think, because the head of the guy is framed within that wonderful triangle created by the arms and the shoulders of the chap, and obviously the arm of the lady as well. So staying nice and loose. You know, I'm keeping in mind the shapes of the contours of the limbs. I'm keeping in mind, you know, the general shapes of things, but I'm kind of, you know, not hesitating to go from one side of a head to another in a weird diagonal line. If that's what happens, that's what happens. And in fact, often those kind of weird, squiggly, random shapes make for the most interesting part of the drawing. And exaggeration is a big thing as well, for me, with these gestural drawing, so the skirt of the dress in my drawing is much more flowing. So there's that first one. I'm quite happy with that one, so I've decided to leave that one as is. Not going to add any watercolor. But for the other two, I'm going to come in with watercolor. So for this one here, although this is pose 3, I thought I'd tackle this first. I'm just using some sepia watercolor. So this is straight out of the tube, just diluted with water. And we've got a fairly dark background in the reference, so I thought I'd begin by just enhancing the sense of light on the figures by putting in a light wash of this sepia in the background. And then I can continue that onto the figures themselves. And one of the great things about watercolor washes, especially when they're dilute like this one is that just like the drawing where you want to stay loose and not get too bogged down with detail, even if I wanted to, this watercolor wash and the size of brush I'm using isn't going to allow me to. So although the brush isn't, massive, it's pretty big compared to the size of the drawing. So I learned to do gestural drawing when I used to go to evening life drawing classes, and typically the teacher would start the class with some quick warm-up studies. And I'd often be working with a brush when I was doing the drawing, and I would often find that my initial studies captured an energy and the essence of the model, sometimes more than my more considered work. So just because we do something quickly, it doesn't mean it has less value artistically than something that's been laboured over for hours. Now, while I was chatting there, I've just tried to suggest a hint of something going on in the background to give these two dancers an environment. Definitely not copying what's going on in the reference, but just trying to give them an area to dance in and a cast shadow there as well. So having done that, I'm now coming in with sepia again. It's simply less dilute. So I can be a bit more controlled with my brushwork. But again, I want to avoid drawing too much. What I'm trying to do is just pick out key shapes and trying to be fairly minimalist in the marks that I make. So I want these, these marks I'm putting down here to be in keeping with what's gone before. So very much the question at the forefront of my mind is, do I need to do any more? And I'm always kind of hoping the answer to that question is no. So for example, with the forearm of the guy, it's just a single line of shadow and then a little curve where his elbow comes out of the shirt sleeve, and that's enough. For his face, we've got we have to excuse the fireworks in the background, like the last video. Last video was just before Halloween. Today I'm filming this just after Guy Fawkes night, so there's a few fireworks going off in the background. But going back to the face of the guy, we've just got a shape of darkness for the hair, a hint of a beard and moustache, and then there are no features in the face. And that obviously makes my life easier in some ways, but it also makes the drawing more interesting, I feel, because if the faces are anonymous, the viewer can read into what's going on in terms of expression and emotion much more than if everything is completely depicted and laid out with no ambiguity at all. All right, on to the third one, different approach, coming in with some of my violet, one of my favourite watercolours colours to use at the moment. It's really quite adaptable. It's a nice replacement for black if you want to go really concentrated with it, but obviously you can do a lighter wash as I'm doing now. Again, I'm trying not to think too much about what I'm doing, trying to avoid, well, things like I just did really. So that kind of brush stroke along the edge of the dress, not really what I want. So I want to kind of disguise that and make the shapes I'm putting in on the background more random. If I get cauliflowers within a wash, all to the good. That's going to add to the randomness of the drawing, add a little bit of energy to proceedings. Now coming in with some orange next. And just trying to pick out the big shapes of midtone and or shadow. Primarily on the woman, but for the exposed parts of skin on the guy, I can use the same color. And next I'm just coming in with some black, actually. Not a color I use that often, or not a tone I use that often. And a dilute wash, and that started to go everywhere, which, the temptation is to kind of mop that up, but I've decided to just kind of let the paint do its own thing and see what happens. And that's the other great thing about working quickly. Best will in the world, if I've spent 4 hours on a painting, I'm going to be reluctant to just let the paint do its own thing too much basically for fear of messing up what I've done. But here we can kind of relax a little more and let the paint guide us into creating the final image. So, the lady in the reference has got, I don't know whether the hair is blonde or light brown, but it's certainly not black. But that doesn't really matter. I can just add some black to the hair and enhance the flow of the hair in my drawing, add a bit of shadow under her arm. And, while that one's drying, I can come back and work on the now dry second sketch. So I switched to a 0.3mm nib this time. So I used 0.2, I might have used 0.1 actually. I think I said 0.2 earlier, but I think I used 0.1mm nib for the initial drawing now that I think about it. So this is obviously 3 times thicker. It just puts down a fine line, but thicker than the previous line. And again, I'm trying to do as little as I can get away with basically here. I'm going to try and pick out key shapes like the collar of his shirt, enhance outlines where required, add little blocks of shading where required, but still trying to keep that energy going. I don't want to kind of clamp down on that initial drawing. You want to kind of keep that flowing line work showing through, keep that sense of movement. So I'm working fairly small here for this demo, but these are great fun to do on a big sheet of paper like A2 or even A1. So if you can get something like a 20 by 15 sheet of paper or 20 by 30, you can really, put your whole arm and body into these gestural drawings, and you can use a nice big, round mop brush, for example, or a big flat brush, and really let loose, because you've got the long handle of the brush, and if you hold the brush as far away from the bristles as you can, and then here when I'm drawing, I'm really just using my wrist and fingers. But when you work on a larger scale, you can obviously use your fingers, you can use your wrist, elbow, shoulder, and be aware of the articulation of all those joints that are available to you. And even your hips and knees and ankles, you can kind of bend your legs and go from putting your weight on your left foot to your right foot, and really kind of bend your back, as it were, and engage your whole body in the drawing process. So not so much doing that here on this small scale, but it's definitely something worth trying if you fancy giving gestural drawing a go. So while I was chatting away, you can see that I've rather enhanced the hairstyle of the lady, and now just adding in a few descriptive lines, but also kind of what I would call character lines as well. So for example, I'm just flaring the dress out over to the right there far more than it is in reality. Let's describe the foot that's peeking through of the guy. on the right hand side of the picture that's just kind of peeking out under the dress. And again enhancing the dress over to the left as well. So that's that one pretty much done. Let's go back to, I think this was sketch 3, can't remember now. So it's important to let the watercolour dry, obviously, because if you try and draw on top of still damp watercolour, danger of clogging up the nib of your pen and possibly ripping up the paper you're working on. But I'm approaching this in the same way that I approached the previous picture. So for example, that curved line to describe the shape of the waistcoat he's wearing, where his shirt is showing through, that's just a little bit of structural enhancement to help describe what's going on. Now where their arms are intertwined, I still want to do the minimum there, but might add a couple of lines in a bit. We'll see. Now the woman doesn't have a face at all really, but I'm not sure she needs one. But a bit of shadow under the arm, a little indication of his shirt sleeve, which is rolled up, a little indication of that cast shadow curving around her torso. And looking at this now, I could probably have done with adding an extra brush stroke of the orange on the left side of her torso. I mean, I quite like the big gap of white on her midriff. So, it's kind of worked out okay. There's a little bit of his elbow peeking through just on the left of his torso. And then I guess I probably could have left the feet more or less as they are, but I think it's sometimes important to anchor the figures on the ground in some way. So I've just decided to describe the silhouettes of his shoes rather better than I had. And I think that still works quite well, but I probably could have got away with leaving that completely. A few little marks on the dress just to suggest some of the ruffles and patterning. And I think the background is working really well with that one. So this one captures a quiet moment really well, I feel. There's a real sense of emotion there, particularly with the girl. But this one has worked quite well. It's got a timeless quality, I feel, because of the sepia. But I prefer the upper half of the painting. So I think, that might be better cropped like this. And I think the final one is perhaps my favorite because there's so little description going on in areas. But either way, hope you enjoyed this demo, and I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show.